Welcome again to the Leaving Canada Speakers Series. This is our fourth installment, which is sponsored by Mennonite Heritage Village in Steinbach and the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies at the University of Winnipeg with support from the Plett Foundation. My name is Aileen Friesen, and I am the Executive Director of the Plett Foundation and the Co-Director of the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies, or CTMS, along with Dr. Ben Knobs-Thiessen, who is the Chair in Mennonite Studies. Mennonite Heritage Village and the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies are located on Treaty 1 territory and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In recognition of the upcoming National Day for Truth and Reconciliation on September 30th, I want to highlight that MHV will be hosting an event on September 29th entitled Unpacking the Doctrine of Discovery to help better equip settler Canadians to understand how historic wrongs have created present barriers for Indigenous peoples. The University of Winnipeg also has virtual and in-person programming this week to encourage learning from Indigenous peoples and cultures and to honor residential school survivors. For those of us who are settlers, I encourage you to seek out these types of events. Tonight, we are here to listen to Andrea Klassen, the senior curator at the Mennonite Heritage Village. Andrea oversees the museum's collection of over 17,000 artifacts, ranging from ceramic teacups, bulky Mennonite wooden furniture, to the 30 heritage buildings and structures that are on MHV's grounds. She also curates the museum's new exhibits each year, and her most recent exhibit, Leaving Canada, the Mennonite Migration to Mexico, is on display now until November 30th, after which she will be launching a virtual version of the exhibit for those of us who are unable to attend the museum in person. For this evening, Andrea will be presenting on the topic that she has been engaged with since 2005, when she conducted her master's research on the Mennonite community in Mexico, as seen through the lens of Die Steinbach Post. Interestingly, MHV is the home of the actual printing press of Jacob S. Friesen, the founder and editor of the Post. And so they have the printing press on which he used to print the paper. And you can ask Andrea if she knows how to use the press during our Q&A after her presentation, or you can ask other questions that come up during her talk. And so please put those questions in the Q&A tab. And now please welcome Andrea as she presents Creating a Community through Die Steinbach Post.
Thanks, Aileen. I'll try not to give away the answer to that question. So let me just begin by sharing my screen here. And hopefully everybody can see that. So good evening, everyone. My presentation is called Creating a Community through Die Steinbach Post. And so we'll just get right into it. On December of 1954, Canadian Mennonite settler J. Banman of Cuauhtemoc, Chihuahua, Mexico, wrote a letter to Die Steinbach Post, a weekly German-language newspaper stationed in Steinbach, Manitoba, and distributed throughout Canada and Latin America. His letter inquired into the state of affairs in the Mennonite community in Tampico, located in central Mexico. After asking about the crops, whether there was a good harvest, and what the industries were in the area, Banman inquired how his co-religionists were getting along with the local population there. He wondered whether the people in that region of the country had received, quote, foreigners like us in the same way as they had Mennonites in Chihuahua in northern Mexico. While Banman didn't shed any light directly on the subject of how he thought Mennonites had received his community in Cuauhtemoc, his opinion that Mennonites were Fremden, or foreigners, in Mexico in 1954 is telling. It demonstrates a self-perception of being an outsider in Mexico, even after 32 years of Mennonite colonization in the country. My presentation tonight is about the idea of community, who becomes an insider and who's an outsider, and how community is created. In the case of Mennonites in Mexico, their self-contained villages and religious and cultural traits that set them apart from the society around them certainly helped to create a sense of community. But there is another aspect to this act of defining a community that we often overlook. And that's how the interactions between so-called insiders and outsiders, rather than eroding social boundaries, can actually do more to create and sustain ideas and definitions of community than we might think. Looking at this question through the unique lens of Die Steinbach Post, we see this idea in practice through the letters written by Mennonites in Mexico to their family and friends left behind in Canada. The letters began appearing in the Post in 1923, about a year after Mennonites first settled in Mexico, and they continue in every issue until the Post closed its doors in 1967. Through the pages of this newspaper, we get a 44-year window to see how a community is established in a new setting and how it is sustained through the first 2 generations. We see that the interactions between Mennonites and Mexican society around them in the marketplace, in times of tension and conflict, and in areas of interpersonal relationships actually serve to define and strengthen, not undercut, Mennonite religious cultural identity. So what happened in Canada to make Mennonites leave? By now, our repeat viewers will be familiar with the circumstances that began this migration to Mexico in 1922. So I'm just going to skip over a lot of it, but give a short recap of the situation. New regulations surrounding the education of children were introduced in Manitoba in 1916 and in Saskatchewan in 1917, which made attendance at publicly inspected English language schools compulsory for children between the ages of 7 and 14. With that, the practice of using German as a language of instruction in schools, which many Mennonite private schools relied on to pass their religion and culture to the next generation, was effectively ended. The new school laws were perceived by the Mennonite community as a betrayal by the federal government in Ottawa, from whom they had received special privileges, including the right to educate their children as they saw fit upon their immigration to Canada. Fearing that the compulsory public schools would lead to further infringement of their religious freedom in Canada, these traditionalist Mennonites began to seek out immigration opportunities in a number of Latin American countries, as well as the United States and other Canadian provinces. As early as August 1919, Mennonites began seeking opportunities to leave Canada. And on March 1st, 1922, with a new privilegium or charter of privileges from the Mexican government in hand, the migration of about 5,800 Mennonites to Mexico began. In spite of the Mexican government's wish that Mennonites integrate into the general Mexican population and teach their agricultural practices to the people there, the immigrants from Canada had an entirely different goal in mind. Their foremost desire was to live in isolation from the rest of society, insulated against the worldly effect of extensive contact with outsiders that would have a, they thought, devastating effect on their communal lifestyle and their unique belief system. Despite this wish, however, Mennonites were in almost continuous contact with outside society during the first 4 decades of settlement. And we see this in the letters written by the Mexico Mennonites to Die Steinbach Post. Moving the story back to Canadian soil for a moment, it's helpful to look at the history of this unique community newspaper, Die Steinbach Post, because it forms the backbone of this story. The Post began in 1913 as Der Volksbote, the People's Messenger, in Drew, Manitoba. Editor and founder Jacob S. Friesen, who you see here sitting inside the Steinbach Post printery there in about the 1920s, early 1920s. Editor and founder, he moved the paper to be nearby to Steinbach. He moved the paper, from Drew to nearby Steinbach to be closer to the burgeoning business community. The paper changed its name in 1915, and the Steinbach Post was officially born. The newspaper also changed its focus at the time from serving the broader German-Canadian community to focusing specifically on the Russian descendant Mennonite community. Along with serialized stories, local news from Steinbach, as well as selected news from Canada and around the world, poems, editorials, and advertisements from local businesses, its pages were filled with correspondence from Mennonites in Canada and the United States. The newspaper underwent a major shift with the Mennonite migration to Latin America. Although it took the immigrants about a year to settle into Mexico before they began to write letters to the Post, by 1923, correspondence and requests to change their subscriptions from addresses in Canada to Mexico started coming in. And just like that, this unlikely small-town Steinbach Weekly suddenly became an international newspaper with subscribers soon to be spread across 3 continents. Most of the letters published in the Post over this period conformed to a specific pattern. Though letter writers could have chosen from any number of subjects about which to write, most chose to focus on specific categories, including giving health updates, weather and crop reports, news from the local community, sharing ideas, and also sending urgent requests for letters from friends and relatives. Conscious that they wrote their letters for public consumption by a largely Canadian audience of friends and relatives, writers seem to have placed more emphasis on events and topics that pertain to the entire group, and not just to their individual households. Within this list of topics, one that might be interesting and surprising for viewers tonight is the regularity with which Mennonites wrote about their non-Mennonite neighbors, people who they called either Mexicana, or Mexicans, or Einheimischen, which can mean indigenous, native, or simply locals. And as a side note here, I'll just add that because it isn't clear whether letter writers were referring to the indigenous or mestizo, those who had Spanish and indigenous ancestry living around them, or perhaps even both, tonight I'll be using the same terms found in each of the letters I'll be discussing. Mennonites encountered their non-Mennonite neighbors from the very first day in Mexico and were in almost continuous contact in many areas of life from then on. Looking at what Mennonites said about these interactions and how they wrote about them in their letters, we can learn more about how the Post helped to build and reinforce Mennonite community on the foreign soil in Mexico. The marketplace was the first and the most obvious place that Mennonites and Mexicans interacted. They literally rubbed shoulders through participating in the economic life of Cuauhtemoc, the little town in Chihuahua near Manitoba Colony, which was the first Mennonite settlement in Mexico. Although Mennonites continued to emphasize agriculture as the best way for community members to earn a living, Mennonite-owned businesses, including cheese factories, machine repair shops, agricultural supply companies, hardware stores, and restaurants, sprang up quickly in the colonies. A service industry also emerged within the Old Colony community, offering the services of seamstresses, self-taught bone setters, or chiropractors, often referred to by their Low German title. And I might butcher this a little bit because I'm not a Low German speaker, but Trachtmokers, and dentists. As Mennonites turned to selling products and services to supplement their agricultural income, and as they extended their business base outside their own communities, they increasingly came into contact with their Mexican neighbors. Mexican-owned stores and shops also attracted Mennonite customers by advertising in High German or having staff learn some Low German to be able to communicate with Mennonite customers. In addition, Mennonites increasingly relied on the services offered by Mexicans. For example, due to the strict guidelines of the Old Colony Church, which forbade the purchase of cars and trucks and the use of rubber tires on tractors, tasks such as transporting produce would be impossible without the existence of paid Mexican employees. With the rise of non-agricultural businesses within the Mennonite community, also came the need for employees knowledgeable in the areas of business administration. Due to the low literacy rates of many old colonists, scholars point out that Mexicans were frequently hired to help in Mennonite-owned businesses. The economic life of Chihuahua created an environment in which Mennonite and Mexicans constantly rubbed elbows with one another. Not all of these economic encounters were satisfactory ones, however. H.C. Penner, a member of the Kleine Gemeindes Quellenkolonie, for instance, used humor and sarcasm in his letter to describe the way in which Mexicans occasionally stole Mennonite straw. He wrote, quote, "A lot of straw is being driven from the colony by Mexicans. In the midst of this trade, however, are many who load up the straw before it has been honestly purchased." In 1953, A.A. Cron used his letter to the paper to vent his frustrations with the Mexican economic landscape and the country's legal system. He writes, "Our business is still poor here. At the end of most days, the cash register displays 0. Whoever's good at math can still figure out how much is left. It's lucky that I still have debt, otherwise I really would have nothing. But the business must keep turning. The Mexicans turn business upside down when they think that we owe them something or when a transaction has not gone the way they wished. Then the entire Mexican law comes after you and we have to pay penalties. When they make a mistake or steal a little, which also happens now and again, everything falls on deaf ears and nothing can be done. There is no law to be found. Openly frustrated with the perceived mistreatments he'd received, Kron clearly found his relationship with his Mexican customers and his protection under Mexican law unsatisfactory. Additionally, this letter betrays Kron's sense of being outside the Mexican legal structure and, by extension, fundamentally different from his Mexican customers, who, in his opinion, were favored in the system and reaped all its benefits. Not all letter writers were this openly critical, but other post writers expressed similar sentiments about the prospects of economic success in Mexico. Nonetheless, despite the varying tones, it's important to note that the frequency with which these frustrations surface in the letters sent to the Post, in comparison to the number of descriptions of more positive economic encounters between these two ethnic groups. The frequency with which such negative reports about the results of Mennonite and Mexican economic interactions were given in these letters demonstrate the Mennonite sense of being fundamentally distinct from their Mexican counterparts. Moreover, this clear differentiation between their own community and the surrounding Mexican population reaffirmed the implicit Mennonite sense of superiority based on culture, ethnicity, and race in comparison to their non-Mennonite neighbors. Mennonites in Mexico unquestionably had a complex relationship with the economic side of life in Mexico. While they displayed an unmistakable sense of pride in and even responsibility for Cuauhtémoc's economic progress and growth since the 1920s, they also clearly expressed their displeasure with the Mexican business environment. These two seemingly competing perceptions of their lives in Mexico highlight the sense of being Fremden or foreigners that Mennonites in Mexico claimed as part of their identity as an ethno-religious group set apart from the rest of society. And this kind of setting apartness persisted, so especially in the areas that we'll discuss now about conflict and tension. On July 4th, 1956, W. Wiebe wrote a letter to Die Steinbach Post, at the end of which he informed his readers that on the night of May 5th, quote, someone borrowed 2 wheels with tires from F. Nelson. The only problem with this arrangement, Wiebe sarcastically told his readers, was that the individual who borrowed them, quote, forgot to leave his name. He concluded his letter with one other account of a robbery that had taken place that same night at A. Peters's in Neu-Rheinland in the Manitoba colony. Here, the thieves, only 2 of whom had since been apprehended, had made off with, quote, a neat sum of dollars and several watches and clocks. This letter identifies a second major area of, shall we say, contact between Mennonites and their non-Mennonite neighbors, and one that many letter writers repeated. They describe the violence, thefts, and other conflicts and tensions that occurred between the two groups throughout the first decades of Mennonite settlement in Mexico. While this particular writer in 1956 chose to represent the incident of the robbery at the Nelson home in a humorous light, crime in the Mennonite colonies was a serious matter during this time. Throughout the 1920s, 30s, and into the 40s, break-ins, thefts, and even murders took place so often throughout the colonies in northern Mexico that most issues of the Post contained letters that referenced the problem. But in looking at this issue, it's important to understand the context in which Mennonites arrived in Mexico. The Mexican Revolution, which had begun in 1910, lasted into the 1920s. It began as a violent reaction against the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz and called for a wide number of social reforms, including land reform for the landless. Mennonites settled in the very region where this unrest had been taking place, and on some of the very lands that were contested by peasant land reformers in the context of post-revolutionary Mexico. Conflict with the land reformers began soon after the arrival of Mennonites in 1922. This conflict understandably soured the relations between these two groups, and it took 3 years to resolve, which created a long period of uncertainty for Mennonites. Even when the land disputes were solved in 1925, the relative poverty of the surrounding population and multiple crop failures in the late 1920s exacerbated the already precarious situation and led to an increase in this activity, especially in the early 1930s. Several writers during this period made comments in a kind of weary kind of tone of voice, very similar to this one from one of the letters, quote, "The Mexicans are at the same old thing again with their stealing," end quote. Little had changed in the situation by 1932. For early in that year, J.J. Peters complained, kind of echoing this same kind of refrain, quote, "It seems almost as if there are no laws as punishment against thieves. Added to this even is the worst. The one who goes for stealing, he'll also go for murder," end quote. In response to the crisis, soldiers were posted in several of the colonies to protect the colonists and their property in the spring of 1932. As Mennonites wrote about these events, their perceptions of their neighbors during this period, perhaps not surprisingly, were typically not very charitable and often contained harsh judgments about them as being inherently dishonest and not to be trusted. A February 1932 letter, for example, begins with, quote, "Well, so what's new? The Mexicans are still at their old game of stealing," end quote. Other writers blamed the soldiers sent to protect them from the ongoing theft, using Black humor to convey their clear distrust for the troops. A letter by Bernhard Penner starts, "The break-ins have not yet stopped completely." He's reporting this in 1936. "The break-ins have not yet stopped completely." And then he continues, quote, "And when our protecting soldiers can't catch the thieves, then they catch chickens during the night instead, for this is easier." He concluded derisively, "We've had plenty of time to contemplate if this is the reason soldiers were sent as we sit behind lock and key," end quote. In addition to the opinion that even the soldiers sent to protect them, much less ordinary Mexicans, were not to be trusted, many writers spoke to other points of contention between Mennonites and Mexicans, especially in 1935 to 36, when the Mennonite private schools in the Manitoba colony were closed by the Mexican government. This issue was a deeply significant one for Mennonites because retaining their private schools had been the biggest reason they had come to Mexico in the first place. And their closure by the Mexican administration constituted a huge and in some cases irreparable breach of trust for Mennonites. As one letter writer in 1936 put it, quote, "Many people have become cynical and mistrustful," end quote. The events surrounding the closure of Mennonite schools throughout Chihuahua had a similar effect on the collective Mennonite psyche throughout the 1930s as the plague of thefts and other crimes had. The simultaneous nature of these events over this decade seems to have augmented their effect on the community, as Mennonites perceived both of these issues as betrayals by the government. As one letter writer in 1936 commented, "Freedoms are now being granted if we promise with our signatures to remain here. But we lack more than simply school freedoms. We lack protection for our lives and property, for robberies are frequent, nowadays almost a daily occurrence, and the entire situation here in Mexico doesn't permit us to stay." The result of the perceived assault on the rights and privileges granted to the Mennonites in 1921, in addition to the lack of protection given them by the government in the face of widespread lawlessness throughout the 1930s, served to heighten Mennonite defenses against non-Mennonite outsiders. The frequent references made to the nature of Mexicans throughout the letters written into the Post, however, did more than simply convey Mennonite distrust for their non-Mennonite neighbors. They served as a cause for Mennonites to turn their focus inwards. They created compelling narratives for themselves about Mennonites as God-fearing people amongst the dishonest, lazy, godless, not to be trusted, and sometimes even communist Mexicans, and underscored their own perceptions as a community of outsiders living in hostile foreign territory. So as we've seen, economic transactions and various areas of conflict and tension created a strong sense of who are the insiders and who are the outsiders on the question of Mennonite community in Mexico. But there's one final perspective from the pages of Die Steinbach Post that I'd like for us to consider tonight, and that's the role of interpersonal relationships. The acts of compassion, casual agricultural advice shared between farmers, occasional visits between neighbors, and informal friendships struck up between Mennonites and Mexicans, as described in the letters published in the Post throughout the 44 years we're looking at tonight, also played a significant role in shaping this interethnic relationship and in the Mennonite sense of community. When Mennonites came to Mexico, they came preceded by their reputation as simple, pious, hardworking farmers. The Mexican government in particular had high hopes for the positive effects Mennonites would have in Chihuahua, introducing modern farming methods and equipment and establishing peace in a region in turmoil. Settlement, however, proved to be full of challenges and frequent failures as the newcomers struggled to adjust to life in Mexico. Mennonites underwent the devastating effects of sickness and disease in both humans and livestock, as well as many poor harvests, as they struggled to understand the agricultural conditions in Mexico that were so different from the ones they'd left behind in Canada. It was into this chasm between expectation and reality that Mexicans stepped to assist Mennonites in the early years of settlement. And ironically, remember that it was actually the Mexicans who, according to even to their own government, were supposed to be the ones learning from the modern Mennonites arriving from the wealthy and developed North. One of the primary areas where Mennonites first began to adapt their ways to those used by Mexicans was in their building methods, and they did this by watching and learning from their Mexican neighbors. Though many began their settlement in Mexico building Canadian-style houses of lumber, the scarcity of timber, along with the gradual realization that these structures just didn't suit the Mexican environment, meant that this practice eventually faded in the Mennonite colonies in the 1930s and 40s. Adopting the Mexican form of housing, however, was a difficult adaptation that could leave Mennonites perplexed. And here we see a slide of some of those first types of wooden homes, these ones built on the Santa Clara colony in around 1922 or 23, right at the start of the community there. And in this slide, as a counterpoint to those wooden homes, we see a house being built of adobe brick. And so this is just, the photograph doesn't actually fit the quote, but it is to show you what these kinds of building techniques look like. In 1933, a letter from Abraham Wolf pointed out how long it took for Mennonites to learn how to build the much superior Mexican-style adobe houses constructed with handmade clay bricks. Quote, "This morning, as we got up, we saw our buildings in shambles. Several walls of the clay brick buildings had fallen out from the big rain that had fallen during the night. We had wondered at first at how the Mexicans had built such thick walls on their houses. One always learns more. We Mennonites understand how to save money, but often not in the right places. We saved on the buildings. We made the walls only 12 inches thick, while it would have been better 18 to 24 inches. Wolf concluded his letter a bit ruefully, quote, "The Mexicans are ahead of us in some things." Evidently, the complicated process of accepting some Mexican customs and methods was not simply an act of acculturation where you just take something out of a different culture and use it as your own, but also it reinforced a sense of separateness between the Mennonites, who didn't possess the insider knowledge they needed to succeed until it was too late, and their Mexican counterparts who did. In some cases, Mennonites fared no better in adapting to new farming practices in a strange physical environment. Letter writers made clear that some of their adaptation was learned gradually by watching and listening to their non-Mennonite neighbors. In his 1923 letter, Abraham Gertzen wrote of the poor condition of Mennonite cattle and crops, comparing them to the animals and farms owned by Mexicans, which were, quote, "in good condition and growing very nicely," respectively. In 1924, B.B. Zacharias observed the Mexican farmers in the vicinity of Cuauhtemoc, noting, quote, "the Mexicans, who have old land under cultivation, planted their corn very deep in the soil in the middle of April, and it had moisture to go up," end quote. The newcomers did not merely notice the relative success of the Mexican farms with envy, but they also learned from the advice they received from their non-Mennonite neighbors. Mennonite letter writers frequently mentioned Mexican advice or words of wisdom about the cycles of weather. At the end of the long and hard year of poor crops in 1929, J. Weeb wearily noted that the Mexicans, quote, prophesy a rich harvest for the coming year, which is also the wish of many, but the probability of coming through the long, tight year seems sad, end quote. Even after the Mennonite communities were accustomed to their surroundings, they continued to listen to Mexican counsel. When storms repeatedly buffeted the Santa Clara and Quellen colonies in April and May 1953, Mennonite writers wrote of the words of advice and encouragement given by their Mexican counterparts. In Santa Clara, Gerhard G. Voth shared that the earth was so dry that many people were having trouble plowing, and others were wanting to cut corn straw already. With a touch of sarcasm, Voth wrote, quote, almost every day is a storm. Thursday the 19th was such a bad storm, I would rather have preferred not to look outside. There were quite a number of dirt drifts. But the Mexicans say, when we have a lot of storms, then we also have a lot of rain. In a similar vein, H.C. Penner's May 1953 letter stated, quote, we had last week Wednesday and this week Thursday lots of wind, which also then turned into a storm. The Einheimischen tell us the more wind, the more rain. Therefore, let us only keep good courage, end quote. In times of trouble, or when Mennonites had become perplexed and disheartened by the harsh Mexican climate, these letters suggest that their Mexican neighbors repeatedly offered them words of wisdom and encouragement. Therefore, while Mexicans were still viewed as the racially and ethnically other in the Mennonite imagination, and were therefore kept at a distance, these letters suggest that some members of these two groups shared a bond in a few areas of life, like agriculture. They demonstrate that through those strict social boundaries continued to play a very significant role in Mennonite life in Mexico. Individual Mexicans nonetheless played an important role in assisting and encouraging the relative newcomers from Canada. Despite the notions of superiority held by the Mennonite community itself, as well as the high expectations applied to it from outsiders, in the first years of settlement, the Mennonites came to realize that Mexicans had the knowledge and expertise required to survive in the Mexican environment that they themselves lacked. By exploring interactions between Mennonites and Mexicans in the marketplace in times of conflict and through interpersonal connections through the lens of these 4.5 decades of Mennonite letters written to Die Steinbach Post, we see regular and consistent interaction between Mennonites and Mexican society. The desire behind the Mennonite migration to Mexico had been to allow Mennonites to keep their distance from, quote, worldly society, thereby safeguarding their traditionalist culture and religion. Ironically, the interactions with outsiders that they had feared would lead to an erosion of these unique religious and cultural values were among the very means by which they kept that distinctive identity and allowed it to remain intact. As Mennonite letter writers commented on the Mexican population, made comparisons between themselves and the surrounding society, and crossed the social boundaries between the two groups, Mennonites in Mexico were able to define a cohesive identity and strengthen community bonds among themselves as a group of German-speaking, Anabaptist, Canadian descendants living as foreigners in the Spanish-speaking Catholic culture of Mexico. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrea, for that fascinating presentation. And the richness of the newspaper as a source is just astounding. How many different angles you can get at, how many different versions of life are presented by very specific points of view. And so it was really great to hear how we can use the Steinbach Post to understand this period of Mennonite history. So we are now in the question and answer period. You can put your questions into the Q&A tab below, and we already have a question there. So I will start with that, but please, everyone else, as you think of your questions, please put them in. So Andrea, did your research uncover any interactions between Mennonite women and the local women? Were there differences in these interactions as compared to those with men? And I guess this also gets to the broader question of Mennonite writers. Are there any Mennonite female writers who are published in Die Steinbach Post?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'll answer the second question first. So yes, there were female writers. Oftentimes people signed off with their names, but sometimes there were also anonymous writers that would have, they were long-standing writers over periods of years. And so they would see themselves kind of as community commentators. And so they would call themselves a reader, or I forget some of their other like kind of handles or nicknames. But so there are some of the anonymous kind of writers who you didn't know if they were men or women. But yes, men and women both wrote letters. As for the interactions between women, that's a really good question. And if there were any, they were so few that they don't stand out to me. So most of what Mennonites wrote about was, often the domain of men. Crop reports. It didn't mean that women didn't write about these things as well, but it seemed that these specific subjects that they latched onto and talked about repeatedly in their letters, mostly those are the places in life that at that point in time were dominated by men rather than women. So any household concerns, those things were typically not talked about as much, and that might be the place where women might feature more prominently. But generally, I don't recall that kind of interaction being talked about in the letters.
Okay, well, thank you, Barbara. That was a great question. So there's also another question about when did Mexican Mennonites begin to learn Spanish, and has fluency become commonplace? I mean, you were talking about in the past now, but I'm going to add on to this question because I had something that kind of pairs with it. Yeah. So I noticed that in newspapers, let's say in Imperial Russia, we start to see near the end of the early 20th century, we see Russian words appearing. So it's German, 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 Russian word. In addition to Robert's question about when did Mennonites begin to learn Spanish, do we see any Spanish words appearing in Die Steinbach Post?
Yes, we do see Spanish words appearing. And that was, if I'm going way back to like 2005 at this point, when I was also looking at the letters from Paraguay. Often the words that were written in languages other than German would be related to crops. So often they would use the English word peanuts. They would never say like Erdnüsse, for example. And then there were some other crops, and I forget the name now, but they would refer to those crops in Spanish, and those would have been things that they didn't grow in Canada. So this idea of, when you're kind of pulling something new into your culture, you use the word that in that context because it just didn't exist for you when you lived in Canada. So there were words like that. But the original question was, when did they start learning Spanish? I don't have the exact answer for that. I imagine that it would have happened fairly early for a lot of the men, because you do hear stories of, when I'm talking about relationships and interpersonal connections, there's lots of stories about particularly men in this instance, meeting with Mexicans and going on trips with them, or staying at the homes of Mexican families. And so one assumes that in that interaction, they were able to speak with one another. But men are often the people who move outside the home more than women do, and outside the community more than women do. And so I imagine, similar to how it is with other cultures and in other locations, that probably women would have lagged behind that in learning Spanish, just because their sphere didn't run in that track in the same way as men did.
Yeah, your depiction of this relationship, this economic relationship between Mennonite and their Mexican neighbors is just fascinating, and how that seems to be richly depicted in the Steinbach Post. That was a very interesting point. So Ben Nobs-Thiessen, the co-director of the CTMS, has a question, and he's curious about the themes of the Mennonite letter writers from Mexico, how they might compare with prominent themes of Mennonite letter writers in Canada, even though you probably focus more on the Mennonite section side of the letters, and he understands that. Were there questions from insider-outsider relations, security coming from Canada?
So as I'm understanding the question, he's asking, did it differ from Canadian letters? And I will say here, I didn't read all the letters in the paper. I read all of them that came from Mexico and Paraguay, but I didn't, after 1923, when the first letter came from Mexico, then I switched over to just reading the Latin American letters. So I don't have a good sense of what the Canadian letters contained, but I think when I've read other studies, it does sound like that's kind of the repertoire. What's going on in the village is crops, weather, that kind of thing. So my guess is, yes, it would be very similar, but I can't say I studied the Canadian, the letters that originated in Canada. The second part of that question, can you remind me again?
Just were there questions about insider-outsider relations and security coming from Canada?
Yes.
Or what are the prominent themes also? Although that was for the Canadian context, but yeah, were there questions about insider-outsider relations?
Right. So did Canadians want to know what that was like? Yes, they did. And there was often, sometimes there were reports written by Canadians visiting the Mennonite colonies. And even though they originated with a Canadian voice, I read those because they do reflect the experience in the Mennonite colonies and also what some of their Mennonite hosts would be doing. So there was, one letter, for example, I forget his name, and I forget the year, but I think it was in the early period of settlement. So in the 20s or early 30s, but 20s, I think. This Canadian comes down to visit the Mennonite colonies and just see what's going on. I guess, he knows people maybe, but it's a travel log. So he's writing this and the Post publishes it, presumably because they know their audience will be interested. And so he writes about going with his Mennonite hosts to different Mexican homes and the, interaction between the Mennonites and the Mexicans. And he doesn't say a lot about what that might have looked like, at the dinner table or what they talked about, but he does mention these things. And so I do think that there was a Canadian interest in what was happening there, especially in those early years. And there'd also often be conflicts in the paper where somebody would write something negative about the Mexican experience, and Mennonites in Mexico would, spring to the defense of, it's not so bad down here, and the Mexicans actually are really good workers. I was out there threshing with them and they threshed from sun up to sundown. So, take that. So it was very interesting to see those dynamics and that conversation happening between Mennonites in Canada and in Mexico.
Yeah, that's great. That actually got to one of the questions I was thinking in my mind is sometimes these letters become dialogues between different people, right? There's like these responses that come in and the letters build on each other. And that, if there had ever been any sort of ways in which they enter into debates with Canadians or also debates with each other about these themes, and where there's these different perspectives, different interpretations on their neighbors are being, presented.
Yeah, one of those was when the soldiers were stationed in the Mennonite colonies. You had a big kind of back and forth between the Mennonites there saying, yeah, this has really helped the problem. And then like the quote I read saying, the soldiers are just as bad as the people that they're defending us from. So you do see these conversations taking place.
So we have another question from Natalia, asking that since there were a lot of challenges with early settlement in Mexico, was there any discussion about the decision to immigrate and any sort of questioning of that decision on the pages of Die Steinbach Post? Yes,
especially after the school closures in 1935 and 36. So before then, the beginning was very rough. I mean, they got there, they realized part of the land that they had purchased was claimed by the land reformers. There's lots of conflict going on there with the local population, which created a really bad environment to start out with. So there were lots of people who were very dissatisfied and essentially came home right away, came back to Manitoba and Saskatchewan. But when you hit 1935 and the schools get closed, everything just, like, it seems like community life almost stops. And so there's some letters almost immediately they start talking, there's rumblings about emigration going on. Mexico is just as bad as Canada was another of the line. Some of them talk about going back to Canada. Even if we don't have our freedoms there, at least we're safe. is what some of the people said. But this idea that the schools get taken away, and it seems very quickly a good portion of this group of Mennonites says, we won't allow this to happen, even though we just settled here, we just arrived. So there's a big debate back and forth. They talk about community meetings, and they debate that in the pages of the Post as well. And some people do leave, and some people stay. And when the schools are reinstituted, they kind of feel like they're on shaky ground. That breach of trust, I think, was a very big one, and it happened to that generation twice, in Canada once, and then again in Mexico. And so you do sense this even ones who stay, but feel very uncertain about the future there.
So another question, and you've answered this a little bit now with that very in-depth answer, but just in case you have anything else to add, Victor wanted to know if you could say something about how Mennonites responded to the school closure in 1935 to 36. Is there anything else you might want to add to that?
In some ways, they responded similarly to in Canada. They did send delegations to Mexico City. You do read reports, saying, well, our delegation returned and they got next to nothing done, or, the Mexican government was so busy they didn't even listen to them. But they did send delegations to the federal government. The schools were closed at the state level, I should say, in Manitoba colony. So they did petition the federal government, and eventually the federal government steps in and opens them again, which is, I think, pretty extraordinary in the Mexican setting, where there was, a distinct kind of pushing the religious side of life kind of to the outskirts after the revolution, to allow this foreign-born group of Canadians to have religious schools was very different than how the rest of the population was allowed to operate with Catholic schools, for example. So some of those same approaches that they took in Canada, they took in Mexico as well.
So this school question has struck a nerve with our audience, and someone asked if you could elaborate on, first of all, why the schools were closed in the mid-30s, and another question is if you could say a little bit more about education of Mennonites in Mexico, who became teachers, who paid for Mennonite education.
Okay. So I'll start that answer by saying I'm no expert on the Mexican Constitution, but one of the outcomes of the Mexican Revolution was this. Mexico was a highly Catholic country, and one of the outcomes of the revolution was the idea that the Catholic Church and religion in general should not have so much power in society, and so that was one of the things coming out of the new constitution, that religion just wouldn't have that big of a role in social life anymore. And so the number of churches, I believe Catholic churches, were cut. The number of Catholic institutions were cut quite a bit. So religion is just really curtailed. So the fact that Mennonites come into this situation and get special permission to have completely religious-based schools is a little bit of an anomaly in that context. And so it takes until the government changes hands in 1935 for that new constitution, or that emphasis of the new constitution, as I understand it, to start to be put into practice in Chihuahua, so in Manitoba colony there. So that was kind of what led to the school closures. As I understand it, it was bringing Mennonite schools in line to what was generally kind of normal for the non-Mennonite world around them. But obviously it stood in contrast to the promises they were given in 1921. And so that's where that dilemma comes in. It depends, I guess, on whose perspective you look at. In thinking about education in Mexico, who are the teachers? Mostly men at that point. Obviously, my look at the Steinbach Post ends when the Post closes its doors, 1967. So I'm not talking speaking to the contemporary situation there at all, but mostly men were leading the schools. School education would kind of be focused on learning the catechism, learning to read High German, learning to read the Bible, studying the catechism to understand their role in the church as they grew up. So very similar to education in the private schools in Manitoba. not part of the Mexican system at all held in the High German language. So very similar to what they left behind in Canada, because that was their goal, to reconstitute these schools and maintain that kind of education for their children.
Great. And if I can just add a question about the Steinbach Post, and this might be outside of your research area, but was there any feeling on the part of the editor and the publisher about becoming this sort of hub of Mennonitism, or any, like, I mean, as you stated in the beginning, they were just a small paper, and then all of a sudden they have readership all over.
Yeah.
Any sense of how that affected the newspaper?
I don't know. There's not a lot that I've found written about the newspaper as like the history of the paper. There's a few articles that are fairly short. Looking at the pages of the paper itself, I didn't get the sense, the editor didn't make comments like that. He would sometimes insert, Jacob S. Friesen, and then the editors that came after him, they would sometimes put little comments into the publication, especially when they're answering questions from readers. How much is the subscription? And then they'd put in, little brackets and answer the question. But there were very few like overt kind of comments like that. I didn't see anything that was like a reflective piece after 10 years of readership on 3 continents saying like, wow, how we've grown, and we might do that today, but I don't know, maybe he was too busy printing the paper letter by letter and sending it out all over the world. That's a really interesting question. I love this story of this newspaper that's so tiny and becomes something really, really neat. But I don't know what the editor would have thought of that.
We also have another question about the Post, which is it available online? And actually, I will answer this question because the Platt Foundation did pay for Mennonite Heritage Archives to start digitizing Die Steinbach Post. So it isn't available, I don't think, online yet. Andrea, correct me if you know.
Not that I know of. I looked at it on microfilm at the provincial archives.
Yeah, so it's not available yet online, but it hopefully will be in the future, and then you can research. Is there any index that was created for the Post? Do you know?
I feel like there might have been a selective one. Don't quote me on that. It sounds vaguely familiar. I love this paper. And so when things like that happen, I sit there and I think, oh, that's so great, because now it gets its due. I think there might be something like that out there, but maybe selective. Conrad would know.
Yeah, I think there might be also, and we're going to get scolded later on with that for not knowing the answer to that question. But you can look forward to the Steinbach Post being online at one point. So Robert asks, since Mexico was interested in the agricultural prowess of the Mennonite community, did the farming difficulties and crop failures of the early years affect how the Mennonite communities saw themselves in terms of having superior agricultural knowledge and techniques?
I don't think in a fundamental way. I mean, you do have those letters that say, well, in some things, the Mexicans are ahead of us. And it's kind of like a backhanded compliment when you say something like that, because you do think in most things you're ahead of them. And so I saw some letter writers be a bit more self-reflective about that, like, hey, we actually didn't know what we were doing. But most of them retain a pretty solid sense of superiority almost across the board. So I'd like to say that tempered it a little bit, but it didn't very much.
It's interesting to think that also, if you look at newspapers from Imperial Russia and other places, we see this same kind of element of superiority that Mennonites are projecting, this same derogatoriness towards neighbors. You will also see periods when someone will pipe up and say, oh, but no, you're not actually treating them fairly. And then all the rest of the letters will be all negative once again.
Yeah.
So we definitely have a history of this type of behavior through newspapers that hasn't been fully studied.
I think that would be a great topic for somebody who is able to read all the different languages that it required, because I do see that that is a thread that's kind of consistent. And it's so wonderful when you read letters that aren't like that. You know, the one about building houses, I think, was my favorite letter out of all of the ones I read. It can be a bit mind-numbing sitting in front of the microfilm machine, and then you see, oh, he said this about the Adobe brick homes. We know how to save money, but not in the right places. And I thought, yes. But I think that is a common thread throughout a lot of these things.
Yeah, so that is a project, hopefully, that someone will undertake in the future.
Yeah.
And I think we are now about out of time. Finally, Andrea, can you use the printing press, the Steinbach Post printing press? Can we all come down to MHV and watch you use the printing press?
Maybe one day soon. I have several very keen volunteers who are willing to teach me, but that has been on my list for almost the 8 years that I've been there, and it's never quite made its way to the top of the list. But I'm hoping that maybe next year you can check in on a festival day and find the senior curator printing.
We're going to hold you to that, Andrea. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. I know we all enjoyed that very much. And I just want to remind everyone, our audience, that we have, first of all, we have Leaving Canada, the Mennonite migration to Mexico. So that is the exhibit that is currently on display at MHV, is going to be there until November 30th. And so if you haven't checked it out, please do. It's an outstanding display. And I want to draw your attention to the fact that next month, October 21st to 22nd, the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies will be hosting the conference Departing Canada, Encountering Latin America. And Dr. Dstein has organized a stellar conference for you to enjoy. It is both in person and virtual for those of you who cannot make it to Winnipeg. So that will be at the University of Winnipeg. And finally, our beloved Dr. Royden Lowen, former chair in Mennonite Studies, will give the last webinar of this series on November 1st. His talk is entitled Mexico Mennonites Nostalgia for Old Canada. So that there'll be an email that will go out for you to sign up for that event. And if you missed this presentation, want to watch it again, or want to share it with your friends and family, this will be posted on the CTMS and MHV YouTube channel. So you can enjoy this presentation once more. So thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Thank you to Andrea for a wonderful presentation, and have a great night.